Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So there's three things I wanted to talk to you about today which are very important. The first one is an article that the Israeli website Zman published titled "Hundreds of Thousands Left Israel After the War." In its article, it relied on information from the Population and Immigration Authority in Israel. It said that on the 7th of October, 600,000 Israelis were already on vacation. After the war started, these people never came back. Some of them might never come back, according to the article. It also stated that 370,000 Israelis left Israel after the war started, which takes the total number of Israelis who either left or did not come back to Israel because of the war to approximately 1 million, which is a very significant number, taking into consideration the fact that already 1.2 million Israelis live outside of Israel. Why is this significant? Well, because firstly, these 1.2 million Israelis, who are mostly Jewish Israelis, already live abroad but are included in the yearly statistics when counting the population and demographics of Israel. And population and demographics is very important. Israel established itself based on ethnic cleansing to have a Jewish majority and expelled hundreds of thousands, approximately 750,000 Palestinians, to have the Jewish majority demographically in Israel, or at least in the 1948 occupied territories. So that's an important thing to note here. Why is it different this time? Well, because approximately 6 years ago, when you count the number of Palestinians and Israelis from the Jordan River to the sea, which are the territories that are de facto under Israeli control, albeit if Gaza was controlled by the Palestinians or parts of the West Bank are controlled by the Palestinians, albeit in a very limited manner in the West Bank because Israel has the full security control. That means that 7 years ago, the number of Palestinians in the historical land of Palestine, or all of the territories that Israel controls now de facto, have superseded the numbers of Israelis. But now it gets even more interesting. Why? Because if you take into account the fact that 2.2 million Israelis are outside of Israel, this gives a much bigger majority to the Palestinians who live in historical Palestine, including the West Bank, that has approximately 3.3 million, Gaza with 2.3 million, and inside of Israel with approximately 2.1 million Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. This takes the total number of Palestinians to 7.6 million, and the Jewish people, with those who haven't gone back to Israel, to approximately 4.9 million. What does this mean? A couple of things. Firstly, in the last 20 years, more Israelis started to leave Israel, especially post the 2006 Lebanon war. Like I said previously, approximately 1.2 million Israelis live permanently abroad, and the numbers and their children are not considered in the numbers, by the way. So the number is likely to be higher in terms of Israelis who permanently left Israel because they felt like it was unsafe and it was unstable to live in. Also, it's important to note, after the judicial reform that the government led by Netanyahu is trying to push for, there have been an increase in movements calling for Israelis to leave Israel because for them, Israel was no longer a democratic place. It was about to become a dictatorship, and it's not a place that they want to live in. There are a couple of groups online, including on Facebook, called Immigrating Together, in Hebrew basically, and they advise people where to go, which countries are safe, which countries don't have wars in them, etc. Another important thing to note, so this movement started way back, but it increased with the judicial reform in Israel, and it has accelerated immensely after the 7th of October attacks and the beginning of the war on Gaza. But who are the people who are mainly leaving? That's a very important question. In the same article, it mentions that most people who are leaving Israel are those with more liberal views. What does this mean? This means that people who have big problems with the extreme right-wing government and those who have more reasonable views when it comes to the peace with the Palestinians, for example, occupation, settlements, all of these things have left Israel and are no longer there. So Israel is being left to a majority extreme right-wing government and extreme right-wing supporters. Obviously, it's still diversified from multiple aspects, but it's becoming increasingly more radical and increasingly more extreme. And it also means that this minority, if you take into consideration the Palestinians from the river to the sea, is controlling the fate of a majority that doesn't agree with it altogether. This is very important to note. So this group, Netanyahu and his clan, the extreme right-wing settlers, they're taking the whole land as hostages, basically. And this is what many Israelis were saying during the protests against the judicial reform. Now, I had my own comments on these protests because many of them did not also address the root cause of the problem, which is the apartheid and the oppression and injustice against the Palestinian people. And without addressing the Palestinian case, there cannot be sustainable, long-lasting peace in Israel. What needs to happen is a review of the whole situation and an implementation of a full democratic state where everyone can live in peace equally inside the historical land of Palestine. That's number one. Number two, the second thing I wanted to talk about, the Senate did not pass the bill that Joe Biden wanted when it came to the foreign aid for Ukraine and Israel. He wanted to give 105 billion in total in aid for Ukraine and Israel, 14 billion of which for Israel. And the Senate just blocked this. And this is very important. Although they're saying that immigration has something to do with it, it's still important because generally when it comes to foreign aid, it goes smoothly. However, this time they're talking about, no, we disagree on immigration. And some prominent figures in the Republican Party are saying we should basically examine the unconditional support we give to Israel. This resonates with what the defense minister also said a couple of weeks ago, that we should consider having conditional support for Israel. So I don't think when it comes to immigration, it was a very important thing when it came to blocking the aid for Ukraine and Israel, but it was more to start pushing Israel to stop the war and actually find a solution. And we're also heading towards the deadline that we spoke about previously of a few weeks that was reported in Israeli circles and was published on the Israeli army radio, that America is giving between 2 to 4 weeks to Israel to finish this current campaign and reach a full-out ceasefire where a hostage and prisoner swap deal would be reached with the Palestinians. So that's a very important development that could potentially push for a de-escalation and us reaching a ceasefire. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about is today in terms of attacks on Israel and very big battles in Gaza. So yesterday, there were very intensive confrontations, and it was reported, Israel's army said that it was the toughest day since the beginning of the war, and that they had very massive losses during the war on Gaza. Simultaneously, the Hamas spokesperson, Al-Qassam spokesperson, Abu Ubaida, said that they demolished partially or wholly 176 Israeli tanks and soldier carriers in the last 72 hours. Now, that's a very big number, taking into consideration that each one of them holds at least 4 personnel. Also, today, not only there were big attacks, big battles in Gaza, there were massive attacks, rocket attacks on big Israeli cities like Tel Aviv and even northern Tel Aviv. So 3 rounds of big rocket launches from Gaza, and reporters said that it resembled the beginning of the war. So imagine this, we're the second month in this war, when the aim was to demolish the Hamas, or now they've reduced it to hurting their military capabilities. They are still able to launch full throttle attacks into the deep, large cities of Israel. This is a massive hit to Israel and the military campaign and the whole war on Gaza altogether. The fact that they're still able to conduct such large-scale attacks on Israel shows how much the whole war was completely pointless. Another thing, a very important thing that happened today, was Israel, for the first time since the beginning of the war, actually tried to rescue a hostage from Hamas by force. Hamas then released a statement that they fought the Israeli soldiers, and several of them were killed and were injured after the failed attempt, and that the hostage himself lost his life and they still have the body, which just is really a highlight, this what happened today, because since the beginning, they told them, as in Hamas, they told them that their main aim is a prisoner swap. Israel decided to punish the whole Gazan population, knowing that they were unable to beat Hamas militarily, but they acted out of pure vengeance. And now that they're trying to actually rescue some of the hostages, they're killing them, and they're killing the soldiers who are trying to rescue them. What is the point? And the attack already happened. Why didn't you sit down from the beginning? You probably knew that it was about to happen, Netanyahu, and he allowed it to, thinking that it's going to save him, right? Why don't you sit down, save all of those unnecessary lives, and reach a prisoner swap? You have thousands of Palestinians in administrative detention with no charges, and you have your own prisoners in Gaza. Sit down, talk. That was the only way you released them, wasn't it, during the temporary ceasefire? Why don't you do that from the beginning? And why are you not doing it now? This just highlights how important it is to actually sit down and talk and negotiate. Israel won't be able to reach any of its objectives by force. As a matter of fact, without America's support, Israel would have done nothing. So why don't you sit down, have a full rethink about everything that you're doing, negotiate a hostage deal, and work towards an all-out solution that ditches the previous two-state solution that has never worked, and that was, quite frankly, successive Israeli governments were not interested in since the assassination of the only Israeli prime minister who was about to make peace with the Palestinians, Yitzhak Rabin. That's a very big highlight of this war. So if it's the actual hostages you're worried about, you're killing them because they're not going to give them to you for no reason, and you're risking your own soldiers and killing your hostages at the same time. So what's the point? I think the big countries and big supporters of Israel should start rethinking what the hell they're doing in Israel and between the Palestinians. Sit down, talk, and try and reach an all-out solution, especially because this is also causing outrage inside of Israel. And I think many people are not talking about the fact that this whole war is led by one person's desires primarily, Benjamin Netanyahu. The longer this war takes, the longer this guy is on his seat. He knows when the war finishes, it will be his end. And what he's doing is he's dragging the whole country with him and committing this genocide in Gaza along the way just to save himself from corruption charges, from facing criminal charges, from going ahead with his judicial reform that will most likely collapse after this. And yet no one is talking about this. It's time that this insanity stops and people go into a serious negotiation process that will give both the Palestinians and Israelis the same equal rights between the Jordan River to the sea.